A common professional developer question in an interview is, what is the Android activity lifecycle? Well, we're going to go over that now. You see, when you're running a mobile app, it's not just a start and finish idea. At any point in time, someone could get a phone call or text message or navigate away from your app. So it's up to us as developers to be responsible for maintaining the state of what the user was doing, even when they're not actually interacting with our activity. That's what the lifecycle gives us, is it gives us a list of method calls that will be called that we can override to either support the creation and startup of our activity or put things back together and save things when it's being shut down. So let's go over each of those particular moments of time and what they're used for. Well, at first you have onCreate. This is before your application is even visible. That's the very start of how your application is going to be. So here's where you'd want to put code to, for instance, set up the UI or just get initial state. Next comes onStart. Again, this is still when the application isn't visible, but it's after that moment of being created. The reason why is it could come from an event of somebody actually stopping your application and then restarting it. OnRestore instance state. Again, your application is not visible yet. What this particular method is used for is when a user is actually coming back to your application from a stopped or shut down state, and you need to quickly put things back together from a saved particular state that you took care of. I'm going to show you a really interesting example of this, but in a little bit when we actually look at the app that I have for you, which will show you all these things in real time. Next we have onResume. It's the last thing that happens before the application is actually in a state waiting for the user input, and it can be either when it's not visible or when it's been partially obscured, as we'll see from the shutdown sequence. So, this is the state that we're normally interacting with our app. It's when we're touching buttons, navigating menus. But if another intent takes control, or the user leaves, or a phone call comes in, any of these things that are basically guaranteed to be an intent changing what activity needs to be used, then we go to the shutdown sequence. The first thing that gets called is onPause. And onPause is really useful for if you have a little pop-up dialog, something where the activity is still just barely being used underneath, visibly, but doesn't have any focus. At that point, it's possible that that dialog might be dismissed, and you can go right back to onResume and come back to this waiting state. This is really useful if you don't want to actually go all the way over here and do all your setup again, and you really just want to resume what you were doing before, but need a little bit of code to help you out. If we're actually shutting down, onSave instance state is going to be called. This is our opportunity to actually save the state of the application because we're not going to have access to the forefront main thread anymore. This is where you'd want to save state changes if a user was perhaps setting text dialogues or choices in a certain way, either to a database or to disk, or at least just some temporary way for future retrieval. Next we have onStop. Again, both of these, our activity is no longer visible, and this is primarily where you're going to want to put down shutdown code, things to clean up after yourself. This is really where the application is stopping for the first time. Now at this moment, on onStop, we have three different pathways that could happen. Either the user could go right back to it, in which case onRestart is called, and we go through the cycle again until we're waiting for interaction. It's gracefully shut down in some way, in which case onDestroy is called, again, not visible. And finally, the activity no longer exists. However, there is the possibility in the Android OS that somebody could force quit your application, or the Android operating system itself could need to stop your activity due to low memory resources. It won't always call onDestroy, so don't rely on this method being called. Think of this as being more of the polite method for cleaning up after yourself. You want to put code there that is of good practice, but not anything that's necessary. So now that you have a really clear chart of all the different moments that could happen, let's take a look at what actually goes down when the application is being run. So here we have an application, and it's going to actually display to us every moment in the life cycle that it's at. Let me show you. Here in the code, I've overridden all the onCreate, onStart, onRestore, etc. methods from my inherited superclass of activity, as you can see here. All these particular methods are doing is, when they run, they're calling their super, and then they're just having a particular status that's going to be displayed underneath with the numbers so we can see what order. You're going to see this type of convention used all the time when you're dealing with events. This idea of on create, on start, on restore instance state. And you should do the same thing if you're creating things that react to events. It's a normal Java convention to use the phrase on and then the name of the event to signify that this code will be run when the application is started. So let's go ahead and run this. And if we quickly look over here, we'll see activity created, activity started, activity resumed, and there it stops. Let's take this over one, pull in our chart, and watch it right next to it. Now if I press back, you'll see activity paused, activity stopped, activity destroyed. So we actually got onDestroy to work. If I come back into it, again we see activity created, activity started, activity resumed. Now here's where things get a little strange. When dealing with the life cycle, I'm going to show you an event that will often confuse a beginner when they're first dealing with this. But when you're actually seeing this back to back, it'll make a lot more sense. I'm going to press right here, which is the equivalent of rotating my device, and watch what lifecycle events get triggered. Paused. Saving instance. The activity is stopped. The activity is destroyed. The activity is created. Then it's started. Then it's restoring that instance. Then it's resuming. So what did we just learn? Well, what we learned is a rotation event in Android actually tears down the entire thing and then brings it back up again. This allows us to take a portrait view and save that state and then reapply it to a completely different UI if we wanted to for a horizontal view. By being familiar with where in the Android activity lifecycle different events come in and stop and start, you will be able to make your experience be incredibly seamless to the user, regardless if they're checking text messages or using their phone very heavily with other apps. I encourage you to play around with this app and try to predict what the life cycle will be, and then go through those motions and see if it is actually what you predicted.